Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is former Senator and co-chair of the Concord Coalition, Bob Kerrey. Senator, thank you so much for joining me.
You're welcome, Brittany. Nice to be with you.
Nice to have you. And the debate, historic presidential debate between former President Donald Trump and current President Joe Biden was held last week. Before the debate, though, you penned an op-ed in the Washington Post entitled this, "Don't waste the Biden-Trump debate, make them answer this question." And the question was on the national debt. And as we know, as the debate played out, there's a lot more of conversation of how things were said versus what was said. But I do want to start with substance here. There was a question on the national debt. What do you think? How do you think the question was posed? And what did you think of both presidents' answers?
They dodged the question. I've been relatively good at dodging questions myself, so I know what I'm seeing. They didn't answer the question, and it's relatively easy to make it sound like you really care when you don't. The debt has been going up steadily. We now, the interest on the debt is larger than the Department of Defense, and it's getting larger. So, and it's doable. And we were paying off debt when I left the Senate. It was hard. Republicans had to do things they didn't want to do, and Democrats had to do things they didn't want to do, but it worked. And then we went right back to, if you just cut the taxes a bunch and make people happy with tax cuts, it'll solve the problem. It didn't. We're right back where we were before. And now, unfortunately, it seems to me one of the big problems is, especially in the political class, they just don't seem to have a sense of urgency to solve it.
And let's talk about exactly where we are in terms of the debt. According to the Nonpartisan Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, they estimate President Trump was responsible for approximately $8.4 trillion of national debt. And then the same committee has estimated that President Biden, at this point in his presidency, has approved $4.3 trillion of debt. So has any president between Biden and Trump showed any type of leadership when it comes to the national debt?
Well, there's nobody between. Yes, George Herbert Walker Bush did, Bill Clinton did, and between the two of them, we started off with about 4% of our economy being funded every year with debt, and at the end of those two presidents' terms, 12 years, we were paying debt down. We were actually paying off debt not that long ago. So it's absolutely doable, but you got to be willing to do that. As I said, Republicans don't want to raise taxes, Democrats don't want to cut spending. And unless you do a little bit of both, you don't get the job done. So and what's happened, I think, especially in the last 10 or 12 years, is a growing number of people, incorrectly in my view, saying debt doesn't matter. They'll say things like, well, it's about the same as it was after the Second World War. Well, gosh, after the Second World War, we had used that debt not only to win the war, but we used the debt to invest in productive businesses, part of the defense industry, and lots of non-defense businesses that were invested in as a consequence of that debt. And we began rapidly to pay the debt down because our economy was booming. So it's not the same thing. I think if the best way of seeing it, I think, is you look at the individual programs themselves. So what I would have preferred that Dana and Jake had asked is, what do you say? What do you say to a 60-year-old? Your plan, which is the Do Nothing plan, the Do Nothing plan has a 17% cut in benefits for anybody 60 years of old and under. And the younger you get, the worse it is. So what do you say to that 60-year-old? That under current law, they're going to get a 17% cut in their benefits. And they say, well, we're not for a 17 cut. They'll deny they're for it. But the current Do Nothing plan does exactly that. And part of the problem, Brittany, is that politicians don't have to face that question. They don't have to face and explain the consequences of doing nothing to Medicare, Social Security, and other people who depend upon these programs.
What's your answer to that question then? When you hear someone say debt doesn't matter, I mean, it's a $1 trillion problem. It sounds like it does matter. So how does it matter, and what are the consequences of this sky-high debt?
All of us away from Washington, D.C. understand that debt has to be either paid back or somehow you got to reduce the value of the debt. You got to get some of it forgiven. And that basically means devaluing our currency. So you got to pay it back. And the Chinese have $1 trillion worth of debt. Other foreign countries have $7 or $8 trillion. We talk all the time about wanting to be strong and want to get back to where we were before. Well, we got a long ways to go to make America great again when it comes to the amount of federal debt that we've got, and it hinders our capacity to do the things that we know need to be done. So it's not a trivial matter, and it's just going to take. Let me put it this way: on the 6th of June this year, we celebrated the 80th anniversary of D-Day, and anybody that watched that was quite moved by these old men coming up and saying, I was here, and Jim died, and John died, and Bill died, but we did it for the future. We didn't expect anything in return. We weren't looking for anything. They were completely unselfish. And it's going to take that kind of attitude on behalf of the country to get it done, because you're going to have to do some things, and some groups are going to be very unpopular.
What's the solution here? Because in Donald Trump's answer to the debt question, he did eventually go on to immigration. When President Biden was talking about the national debt question, that was the question where he froze up and ended up saying, "We beat Medicare." In your op-ed for the Washington Post, this is what you said for a possible solution. "We don't need another commission. We need the president and Congress to do their patriotic duty and lead." What does that leadership look like?
You're going to have to come first. You have to come to the American people and tell them the truth. You can't come and dodge this. You got to say, here are the facts, and it's not complicated. It's not like a cure for cancer. It's a relatively straightforward problem. We're spending X, and we're from taxes. We're generating, I don't know, X minus 5% or 6% or something like that. We're going to borrow another $1 trillion this year, I believe, to cover the difference. And the only way we can solve that problem is be aware that we got to keep the economy growing. All of us want the economy to grow, so we got to look for a way to generate additional revenue. Take Social Security, for example. It's a relatively easy problem to solve. You are going to have to raise some additional revenue. I personally would like to see lower income beneficiaries get more rather than less. 40% of them right now, that's all they've got for income is Social Security. You're also going to have to make adjustments in the benefits. And for you that are covering this thing, the first thing that will happen for every single time there's proposals to fix Social Security, the people will be turning out their heads saying, Bob Kerrey wants to move the retirement age back. That's not true. There's no such thing as a retirement age any longer. We eliminated the need to quit work in order to get Social Security benefits. You don't have to retire to get Social Security. There's an early, there's a normal, and there's a late benefit. That is true, and those are going to have to be moved a bit. So you're spending and you got revenue, and you got to balance the two out. And it's supposed to be covered for all. All generations. 75 years is supposed to be covered, and it's not even coming close. It's just not fair, and not fair. And so you got to come and say, we can solve this problem. We're going to have to reduce the benefits a bit. We're going to have to generate some additional revenue. We can keep our economy growing. We can make Social Security even more fair than it currently is. But we got to be brave. We got to think of those men who landed at Normandy, 80 years ago, and say we've got to act the same way, because it is going to take courage. It's not going to be easy, and the American people have to recognize and appreciate when you've got people when they do finally step forward and say we're brave enough to get this done.
You're very clear-eyed here, saying there is a solution and it's very easy. We just need to come to the table and talk. Do you think people right now, politicians, aren't coming to the table to talk about this because we're living in such a deeply divisive, partisan time right now?
Well, I think it matters. Although it's not the first time we've had difficulty solving problems, but people have opposition to all kinds of things, and the solution to Social Security, as I said, Republicans say, "Oh my God, I don't want a tax increase." You can't solve it without a tax increase. Well, I don't want a benefit cut. The Democrats will say, "But you can't solve it unless you do." It's not going to ruin the country. Quite the opposite. We're going to be borrowing substantially less money, and more importantly, we're going to be able to say to our children, to our grandchildren, we don't just talk about you. We've covered the cost. We're doing this for you. We're not doing this for us. We recognize that we might win by a smaller amount in the next election. We might even lose the next election. But again, I remind those 535 members of Congress, I'm sure all of them watched the D-Day celebrations and the memories brought forth by these old men who paid the price and we praised him. We recognized the courage it took. If you want to be remembered for having done something that required courage, you need to do something that requires courage, or you won't be remembered for it.
Who do you think is better equipped when it comes to handling the national debt, decreasing the national debt, President Biden or former President Trump?
Oh, I think Biden. I mean, Biden's having difficulty answering the question, but he didn't go to immigration as a solution. No, I think Biden is much more likely in the end, when you get to a point where you got to decide what you're going to be for, to make those reasonable adjustments so those 40% of Americans who only have Social Security get a little bit more than they currently do. So yes, I trust Joe Biden more than I trust Donald Trump at the moment.
That does bring me to the next part of the conversation here, which is President Biden's performance. Unfortunately, you did bring it up. He did say at the end it was a bit incoherent. He did stumble off on that answer and then landed on "We beat Medicare." What is your reaction to President Biden's performance, specifically at the debate?
Sad. Oh, it's sad. I mean, I'm 80 years old. I forget stuff all the time. So I'm not, I'm not, that happens to us when we get old. It doesn't mean that we're incapable of doing work. It just means that now and again, I call you Jane instead of Brittany. I mean, that happens. And it was sad watching it. He was under a lot of pressure. He knew that the one thing he couldn't do was act like he was old. And, when that kind of pressure is on you, all of a sudden you're doing stuff that makes it look like you're older than we thought you were. I do like that the next day he said, I am old. I'm not a young man any longer. I'm having, I have some difficulty walking. He's got some arthritis in his knees. And he doesn't debate as well. I think he's got to persuade Americans that there's whatever cognitive decline is occurring. And I have cognitive decline. It's not shameful. It's just part of aging. So he's going to have to persuade Americans that the cognitive decline is not sufficient to prevent him for the next 4 years of being a good president.
Of course, and he was under tremendous pressure at the debate, but the president of the United States is the toughest job in the world. So do you think he is the man or woman of the moment right now? Is he the best leader of the Democratic Party?
Maybe not, but he is currently the leader and likely the nominee. So all I've got to compare him with is the former president who's also running. And for me personally, it's not a close call. So I think I do worry about him, and I was sad for him. It's not easy to watch an old person have difficulty with something that looks relatively easy. It's not easy. What was asked of him and former President Trump in that intense environment of a presidential debate. But again, I do think, and he's going to have to prove it. He can't just put out a press release and say, oh, I have trouble walking, I have trouble in debates, and I'm old. That's not going to be enough, because what Americans are going to want to know is the cognitive decline that we're seeing, is it enough to impair your capacity to be president? I don't think it is, but he's got to make that proof.
So you don't think President Biden at this point should step aside?
No. Look, I've run for office, I've run for Senate, I've run for governor, I ran foolishly one time ran for president. You can't talk people into not running. Once they're in, it's a fool's mission. He's the one that decided that I want to run for president again, and he's the only one that can decide that he is or isn't going to run.
I talked to multiple lifelong Democrats after the debate. They were more than surprised about President Biden's performance.
Hey, Brittany?
They felt, yes,
Brittany?
Yes.
None of us are lifelong Democrats. We have to wait till we're 18 to register.
Sure. Well, okay. So
you got 18 years. You're free
so after 18 years on the free market, after 18 years on the free market, from 18 years and up, they were voting for Obama, Hillary Clinton, President Biden. They were surprised by President Biden's performance. They felt gaslit. One of them said to me, if I didn't know President Trump's performance as president, I would think he's more presidential right now. What do you say to these voters who feel angry with the Democratic Party right now?
Well, I don't know. It's not my best behavior to make a decision based upon anger. It just isn't. I find it to be understandable. I have plenty of it, but I don't. It's the wrong mood to make a decision, especially as important as this one is.
And so,
That's
what
what
do
I
you
would say.
think? What do you think is the future for the Democratic Party then? Because there is this sense of panic after this debate. There is this sense that they're at a crossroads right now. Do we support President
Well,
Biden?
look, I
Do we
think.
move on?
Well, it takes me, I think, to a different question than the one you're asking. I mean, I think our presidential nominating process has to change. I think it's been corrupted by both political parties, and it makes it difficult to select the best the nation has to offer. I mean, they both voluntarily went out of the presidential debate process. That was a process intended to try to create a nonpartisan environment, and it didn't work. So, I mean, we don't have a federal law. The two parties decide when the caucuses are held, when the primaries are held. They get to decide all of that. And as important as this particular office is, it's the only office when we go to vote that has an impact on the entire country. But we have a crazy nominating process. I'd take the power away from both parties and establish a federal law that determines what's the terms and conditions under which we decide who's going to be president. How much money? When does the money start to be spent? All that. There's lots of things that could be done to improve the quality, not just for the purpose of saying academically it's better, but to increase the trust that people have that we have a process that leads to the best two people that we can possibly find to do the job. Uh-oh, balloons are going up. Did I do that?
They agree with you. There's a celebration for what you're saying. But what is that solution?
Did you do that? Did you
I
have the
didn't
balloons?
I didn't have the balloons going up. I think that was when your hand went up. But I think I mean, the balloons honestly were an interesting touch there because I think there is this sense of distrust in this system right now. So what is the biggest thing that you would say would add trust to this whole entire political presidential process?
Write a federal law that governs the terms and conditions of the presidential campaign. Don't leave it to the two parties. They have all the power in deciding who's going to, what you have to do to become a nominee of the party. It's a corrupt process. It doesn't lead to the best outcome. It just doesn't. So we need a federal law. You need to take the power away from those two political parties. You don't put them out of business. You can still have a political party, but don't give them the power and authority to decide who our nominees are going to be.
I know, circling back to the very beginning of the conversation, I know you didn't think that the national debt question was answered in a way that you would like to see. If there is a debate in September 12th, by all indications, there is going to be a debate in September. Do you want another question on the national debt, and what exactly would that question be?
First of all, you're very good at answering questions. You should be asking questions. You should be one of the moderators because you don't forget what the conversation was supposed to be about. Look, I think
Well,
you
I
have to say
appreciate
this.
that.
I think you have to say, I saw you guys do it. You got to a point you were paying off debt in 2000. What is your proposal to get us back to paying off debt? And if they say, well, we're going to do it with immigration or we're going to do it with growth, it has to be something that puts a constraint on spending, which Democrats agreed to in 1990, and has to do something that has some increase in revenue that doesn't impair growth in the economy. Because, and in fact, in the third piece of legislation that we passed, we cut capital gains because we believed that would increase investment, increase the strength of the economy, and it turned out it did. So I think they've got to be very precise that they'll support a plan that includes revenue increases, that includes restraint on spending, that leads, by every expert opinion, to us being able to pay off debt.
And if they weren't super precise, and if you were the moderator, I'm sure you would turn off their mics until they answer that question.
I would announce to the public, both those two moderators, are they going to do the September one?
No, I believe it's either NBC or ABC.
Okay, so they'll send somebody from NBC and ABC that knows how to ask questions and can tell inside of their bony little heads, they can understand when somebody is not answering the question or when they're giving a answer that sounds like it's an answer, but it's not. They've got to force it, because if they don't force it, they move on to talk about gun control or some other issue, it's all over. They've never put the pressure on what I think is the most important issue in this campaign.
Well, Senator Bob Kerrey, thank you so much for the conversation. I
You're
hope you
welcome.
come back and we can talk about this more. Hopefully, it will be addressed sooner rather than later.